Oh, okay. Okay. Well, hopefully I won't be too long-winded here, and then we can get to the questions. But my basic premise is that the U.S. Unfortunately is in decline. However, this can be reversed fairly quickly and easily. Our foreign policy is outdated, costly, and dangerous, and it has been for some time. And even after 9/11, of course, people didn't understand that. Now, the news this morning is, as the usual in America, the news is gossipy. The headlines are that General McChrystal has made some snide comments about the president and the vice president. He's the commander in Afghanistan. However, the real story to me yesterday was the arraignment in New York City of the Times Square bomber. And he said directly what, of course, bin Laden has been saying for a long time, and that is that they are going to continue attacking the United States until we get out of Muslim countries. That is the issue. George Bush told us in the last administration that the issue was our freedoms. That's why they were attacking us, which, of course, if you stop and think about it, is absolutely preposterous, since there are many countries like Sweden and Switzerland that are very rich, and they have a lot of political freedom, so they have both economic and political freedom, but they don't get attacked. And of course, this blowback is imperial blowback, terrorism, and this has happened to other empires as well as the U.S. empire. Now, I refer to the U.S. as an empire, and in this book, I look at the academic literature, and you can define the U.S. as an empire. Now, it's not like the British or the French Empire or the Roman Empire or even the Soviet Empire. It's a more informal empire. It's a much more sophisticated empire. It's but if any of our major allies ever try to restore the dictatorships, say Germany or Japan, which is probably unlikely now, 50 or 60 years down the road, but if any of our allies were turning their political systems around, you would see the U.S. intervene very quickly. Even during the Cold War, we had very loose influence over their domestic policies, but a lot of influence over their foreign policies as we took Germany into NATO, etc. Now, after the Cold War was over, of course, all this was supposed to be designed to battle the Soviet Union during the Cold War, at least counter the Soviet Union. But of course, the strange thing about it was, if that was the case, then why didn't it all go away when the Soviet Union did? And of course, it didn't. It expanded. We pushed the NATO alliance east to take in the Eastern European countries and even parts of the Soviet Union. We expanded and strengthened the alliances in the East, more strengthened than actual physical expansion. But in Europe, we expanded NATO both in territory and function. NATO is now in Afghanistan. NATO used to be a defensive alliance against the Soviet Union to defend a certain area in Europe, and now, of course, it's running offensive operations in places like Kosovo and Afghanistan. And of course, we have military bases around the world. Now, we've cut back on some of those since the Cold War ended, but there's still a lot of U.S. troops and bases overseas. So we have these bases. We have alliances, which are, of course, is very strange from the founders of the country who warned against entangling alliances. Now we have, and of course, we didn't have entangling alliances for most of the country's history until after World War II. And most of this foreign policy, this offensive power projection, has come after World War II. This was not the traditional American foreign policy, and it's very new. Now, of course, most of the people in this room, all of the people in this room, I think, probably don't remember anything differently. You have to be really old to remember the traditional foreign policy of the United States, and that's pre-World War II, when we didn't have all this. You could make some sort of an argument for this type of a policy during the Cold War to counter the Soviets, although there were other ways of doing it. I call it Cold War light. But now that the Soviet Union is gone, we keep doing the same things. And what the New York City Times Square bomber said yesterday, and bin Laden has been saying, is that they attack the U.S. because we occupy Muslim countries and we intervene heavily in their affairs. It's no secret that these people are from the Middle East, because that's where we've intervened militarily the most. And Robert Pape did a study on suicide bombing, and he came up with the fact that the main reason has nothing to do with religion, or at least minimal to do with religion. It's more foreign occupation, and it's the weak retaliating against the strong for foreign occupation. Now, of course, that doesn't justify killing men and women and children under any circumstances, innocent people, but these are the reasons, and I think we have to be a little bit more aware of the reasons that these things are happening than we are, because we sort of have our head in the sand as far as that goes. Now, the other problem with this policy, in addition to blowback terrorism, first of all, we shouldn't confuse empire and security, because as far as I'm concerned, the empire is reducing our security rather than increasing it. George Bush referred to it as the best defense is a good offense. Now, in conventional warfare, that's true. But when you're battling terrorists or even guerrillas, that's not true. And they found that out the hard way in Vietnam, and they found it out the hard way in Afghanistan and Iraq. And now, of course, they're using more of an indirect counterinsurgency strategy, which doesn't go on the offensive as much. And the same thing is true with terrorists. The terrorists can come all the way into your rear area here in the United States and attack very easily. So the best defense is not a good offense. And in fact, that's the worst possible policy. And I'm afraid we've fallen into bin Laden's trap, both during the Bush administration and continuation with the Obama administration, of occupying Muslim countries. That's exactly what bin Laden wanted us to do, because it revs up his ability to recruit and get money. And we have a heavy footprint both in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it doesn't seem like this president, despite his rhetoric, is going to do that much about it. The first problem is security. The second problem with empire is it's very costly. And I think we're spending much more than other countries do on defense as a percentage of GDP, and in absolute terms. I mean, the Chinese, I always get amused when we have, when Rumsfeld said the Chinese are building their military out of proportion to what they need for their own defenses, and I just had to laugh. Here's it coming from the country that's spending 10 times what the Chinese are spending, and has the most offensively configured force in the world. So I think a lot of times we really don't look at ourselves in the mirror, and we need to start doing that, because I think we really need, with the budget deficit, we have a 10% of GDP as budget deficit. That's a humongous budget deficit. The record was set by Reagan during I think in 1986 it was 6%, and now we're at 10%, and we may go higher than that. And we have a $13 trillion debt, and our numbers look a lot like Greece, and Greece is about ready to go bankrupt. Now, we, of course, are not Greece, because we have the dollar, and that unfortunately allows us to spend more, or at least we think it does. So I think we're overextended. We have 43% of the world's defense spending and 27.7% of the world's GDP. Now, that's a big percentage difference. So we are overstretched. We have been overstretched for a long time, and I think these two small wars, our military can barely fight these two small wars at the same time. So I believe, and my book has a chapter for conservatives, a chapter for liberals, and a chapter for everyone else as to why empire violates the principles of conservatives, it violates the principles of liberals, and it's dangerous for everyone else. I won't go into all that now, because what I'm really talking about today is the devolution of power from the United States to other countries. We have, and I think conservatives really ought to be, even conservatives really ought to be concerned about this, because most empires fall because of financial reasons. The classic case, the Soviet Union had this huge empire, which was, of course, smaller than the U.S.'s, but it had a big empire, but it had an economy that was very creaky, and of course the whole thing just fell in. Britain and France were on the winning side of two world wars, doesn't matter if you win the wars if the wars exhaust you. And of course, what happened after World War II? The French and the British lost their empires. You just go, I go into the history of some empires, and every empire says the same thing. Oh, well, that's not going to happen to us. In the U.S., we have the biggest economy in the world. We're the richest country in humankind. But I'm sure it can happen here as well, particularly with the numbers that we have now. Now, over time, slight differences in growth rates, economic growth rates from countries, can lead to a real reshifting of the world's power. And these statistics are even more dramatic from last year, because last year we were in a recession. These are 2009 statistics, but the U.S. Economy declined 2.4%. Meanwhile, China was increasing 6.5%, and India was doing slightly less than that. Now, normally those two countries have 9 to 11% growth rate. Last year was a bad year for them, and they're growing at 6%, and we're growing at negative 2.4%. So you can see in a recession that they're still growing and we're not. Now, over time, of course, the India and China are the countries to watch. Brazil, perhaps. Not so much Russia in this BRIC. Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Russia, I think, is mainly a petro economy and always has been. And they were going well for a while the oil prices were high. But they're sort of like the OPEC of the North because they have to have high oil prices. So I would say Brazil, China, and India are the countries to watch. Now, it'll be a while before, of course, the U.S. There's a re-shifting of power. But, of course, the U.S. could retrench, pull in some of these alliances which are not needed anymore, get rid of them, perhaps let other rich countries, and by the way, in every theater in the world, we support the rich country against the poor country. South Korea has 30 times now the economy of the North. The North is starving. In Europe, Russia is not very powerful at all anymore in economic terms compared to the European Union, which has a bigger GDP than the United States if you push all the countries together and count them all together. And of course, Taiwan has a per capita income that's higher than China. So these countries could all do more for their own defense, and what happens is we provide their defense. That gives us some sort of influence, but of course this is very vague. Well, what do we get for this influence? We don't get very much at all. We don't even get trade concessions, open their market. In fact, during the Cold War, the idea was to rebuild these countries by giving them access to the U.S. market while not demanding it in return. Now, that was great for maybe the first 10 years after they cleared away the rubble from World War II. Of course, these policies continued, and we don't really get very much for our protection of these countries, except the idea that we have this influence over their behavior, which is really few and far between. And I think this was evident during the Iraq War. The French and the Germans did not agree with the war. And I happen to agree with them. I thought it was a bad idea, but they didn't have any qualms about just saying, well, we're not into it. You're going to have to do this one by yourself. So I think now that the enemy is gone, the Soviet Union is gone, these countries are less likely to toe the U.S. line. So, but we still have these commitments to defend them, and we keep pushing NATO east, and all this, we treat these as if they're paper commitments. But prior to World War I, there were many alliances, and these alliances were outdated, and they drew all the countries into war, a cataclysmic war, probably the most important event in the 20th century. And none of the countries really wanted to go into World War I, but they were dragged into it by outdated alliances. So I think we really need to make some hard choices and confront the cost of these alliances and whether they're impeding our flexibility in foreign policy. Now, this seems somehow a radical notion. This should have all been thought through after the Cold War, but it wasn't. We just sort of kept soldiering along and pushing the empire out. Now, the founders of the country, of course, would pass out if they saw our foreign policy today, because their foreign policy and the foreign policy of the United States up until World War II was to stay out of other people's business and minimize, well, we had no alliances, and the reason for that was because Thomas Jefferson warned of entangling alliances, and George Washington, in his farewell address, warned of permanent alliances. And of course now we have both. And so I think we really need to perhaps revisit the founders' vision. And you say, well, you know, the founders' vision is really great, and we always cite them in the 4th of July and all that stuff, but is this really relevant to today? Now, my view is not excessive adulation of the founders. I just think that this is probably a more viable foreign policy. I think we have to rebuild our economy. All national power grows out of your economy. You have to have money to buy military. You have to have money to send foreign aid overseas. You have to have money to have people emulate your culture. And that's just the facts. And I think there have been other empires who retrenched and regrouped and caught themselves before they declined. The Byzantine Empire nobody ever talks about the Byzantine Empire, but it lasted 1,000 years because it had this area. It was manageable to police, and it was affordable. Now, I'm not suggesting we become like the Byzantine Empire, but I think it demonstrates that you can, if you have a manageable foreign policy. But as I say, we're on the road to overextension. In fact, we are overextended. And I think that conservatives, and not all conservatives are neoconservatives that did the Iraq War, but the conservatives should worry about our decline as a great power if we don't do this. And of course, the liberals should worry about some of these humanitarian interventions, because rarely are these really humanitarian interventions. Usually they have an ulterior purpose. The only intervention that in the last, since the Cold War ended, that was really humanitarian was Clinton's intervention in Somalia, which ended up in a disaster. But his other interventions certainly weren't humanitarian, even though he dressed them up as such. And of course the Iraq war had this, when all else failed, when there was no weapons of mass destruction, and when they couldn't prove their allegation that was linked to bin Laden and 9/11, Bush went to this democracy promotion rationale, which of course hasn't been too successful. Since 1900, Carnegie did a study, since 1900, out of 15 attempts to bring democracy to other countries using force, and I'm not counting Iraq and Afghanistan, I'm counting those as pending, but they're probably going to be added to the pile of failure, we'll see. But out of those 15, only 4 succeeded, and of course those were the first world countries after World War II, of Italy, Germany, Japan, and Austria. So, and most of the places that we're trying to promote democracy, we haven't flattened with military power like we did the Axis powers in World War II, and also they're not first world countries who know how to organize industrial power themselves. So I think it's a very different thing. So we have this excessive foreign policy that the founders would be appalled at. In fact, despite all the patriotism that you see on the 4th of July, and the military usually figures into that, the founders were very anti-militaristic, and they were one of the biggest things, if you look at the founding documents, was they were very nervous about a standing army, even having a standing army, because they knew that a standing army could repress the people. And one of the founding principles of the United States was that they want to have some checks on the executive power, because of kings in Europe would routinely drag their countries into war, and who bore the expenses of that but the people themselves, who had no voice in this. They had to shed their blood and pay their taxes for these kings rampaging around, and the founders of this country didn't want that. So I think we need to be very careful of militarism, and I'm not talking about dumping on the military, because I think, frankly, the military is the #1 victim of militarism. And I think what we have in this country now is we all sit at home and watch TV and live our lifestyles and ride around, probably overspend, and we send the people over to these wars, and we really don't. There's no shared national sacrifice. Now, I'm not advocating national sacrifice. I'm advocating not doing the wars in the first place, because I think a lot of this excessive adulation of the military is because we feel guilty that they're bearing all the costs of the wars. So my view is that we should choose our wars more carefully, and especially in the Middle East, if we lightened our footprint, we would have a lot less blowback terrorism. And I think we need to drop this neoconservative, and the liberal interventionists are out there doing these quote-unquote humanitarian missions, which, if you scratch below the surface, oftentimes are not humanitarian at all, such as the Kosovo bombing that Clinton did, and the Bosnia episode, and even the Haiti episode. Haiti was a very interesting case because Clinton told Aristide he would restore him to power if he would shut off the refugee flow to Florida, because Florida was a very important electoral state, and Florida didn't want Haitian refugees showing up on the shores. But it was portrayed as this humanitarian intervention. That's just one example. So both parties do this, and we have a bipartisan consensus to do this foreign policy. There's a minority of each party that is not in favor of this interventionist foreign policy. It's not the traditional foreign policy of the country, and I'm really afraid that we are going to be displaced probably sooner than we would think by China and India at the growth rates that they have on their economies. China has not followed the Soviet path. We hear rumblings about China doing this and China doing that, if it's some insidious thing, but the Chinese have restrained their defense spending. They have increased their defense spending, but it was from a very low base, and they're very conscious that of the four modernizations, the military is always ranked number 4. They don't want to go down the Soviet road of having an excessively militarized state. And this is an example. The Soviet Union of empires in their final stages get really militarized. They have in their excessive territory, and they can't fund it. The Soviet Union did that, and I'm afraid the United States is sort of doing that too. We reach for the military option because when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So, our military is very, very important to our foreign policy, and probably excessively so. Now, say, well, the founders' policy was great in the 1700s, but what about now? This is a whole different. We have an interdependent world. But this is always the interdependent world thesis. The world has become more interdependent in certain respects, in communication, transportation, etc. But I would argue that the world has become less interdependent in some security aspects. And the reason for that is there's a lot less cross-border aggression since World War II. Now, the primary reasons for that are probably the fact that lots of countries now have nuclear weapons, and other countries don't attack them because they don't want to get nuked in response. The second thing is that small arms have been distributed all across the world. And the third thing is, ever since World War II, we've had an increase in nationalism. People don't like colonial powers tromping over their soil, and they don't like foreign occupiers. And one of the countries that really hates foreign occupiers and has seen so many is Afghanistan. And you have to go back to Cyrus of Persia to find somebody who conquered Afghanistan and held it. You can conquer it, but nobody has held it. Even Alexander the Great, probably the greatest military commander in the history of the world, decided that he was going to get out of Afghanistan and move on to India. So, and of course, more recently, the British lost in Afghanistan 3 times, and the Soviets lost once. So the U.S. really hasn't learned much from those, or hasn't learned much from Vietnam either, because we're making the same mistakes as we did there. But this idea that the world is more interdependent, therefore we need to be everywhere and do everything, there are fewer, even Dick Cheney, after, when he was Secretary of Defense under the first Bush, said after the Cold War, well, a lot of these regions aren't strategic anymore because we don't have this adversary that's trying to get an advantage everywhere. Of course, he later became a neoconservative and was advocating meddling everywhere. So I'm not sure exactly what changed his mind, but he used to realize that this was causing a problem, that we really didn't need to be everywhere, and that we could have a lighter footprint around the world, and perhaps use the military only as a last resort. Now, the main problem that an empire causes is one that's never really talked about, and that's the problem here at home. In ancient Rome showed that building an empire and having a republic are not very compatible, because when they started to get the empire, they lost the republic of Rome. And I think we've been doing that. Most of the time we have civil liberties erosion is during wartime. And we've seen a lot of that during the war on terror during the Bush administration. And the Obama administration, despite him being a liberal Democrat and Bush being allegedly a conservative, their foreign policies look a lot similar in nature. Obama has made marginal improvements in civil liberties, but he has not repealed the civil liberties erosion of the Bush administration. He's also, I would say, Obama has, he's pledged to get out of Iraq. That may still be difficulty. There may be some difficulty with that since we rarely leave anywhere. I mean, we're still in Korea 60 years after the war. We're still in Europe. Still in Japan. So when we occupy a place, we really hate to leave. So we'll see if we get out. And Maliki, the leader of Iraq, has already talked about amending the agreement. Now, whether he'll be prime minister or not, we don't know. But whatever Iraqi prime minister, if the violence starts spiking again when the U.S. leaves, we may see a push to keep U.S. troops there. And of course, Obama has increased the troops in Afghanistan. So he's running essentially the same policy as Bush. Now, he has been more amenable to negotiating with countries that we really don't like too much, like North Korea and Iran. And that does help public opinion around the world. And some conservatives scoff at public opinion around the world and say, well, why do we really need to be concerned with that? We're a superpower. Well, we need to be concerned about it because of what happened in Times Square and what happened in the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Because when you stir up a lot of this anti-Americanism overseas, you get blowback in the form of terrorism. But I think the main problem that we have is we get the blowback, and then even worse than the people that are killed, and that's certainly very bad, is that the freedoms that make the country unique are eroded by the fact that these terrorist incidents happen. So the main problem with this empire is here at home. Over the years, in the original founding, the strongest parts of the system were supposed to be Congress and the states. Well, of course, over time, and particularly since World War II, an imperial presidency has developed. The presidency is so powerful that the founders would be very uncomfortable with it. And like we had Bush claiming that the commander-in-chief role allowed him to disregard congressionally passed laws during wartime. Now, if you stop and think about that, that's rule by fiat. That's what dictators do. Now, of course, I'm not alleging that Bush was a dictator. I'm just saying that's the rationale that they used, and it was a scary rationale. Now, Obama has dropped that, but he still detains people without trial, but he doesn't use the executive commander-in-chief rationale, which is an improvement in my book, but it's still a problem. But you have this imperial presidency, and the Supreme Court has also really gone out and gone outside the bounds of the Constitution repeatedly. So I think the system has been turned on its head. The states rarely have much power anymore over anything. They still have some power, but it's been greatly eroded. And certainly the Congress has lost the war power. We no longer declare wars, as is specifically required in the Constitution. And instead, we have, like Harry Truman did, Harry Truman pioneered this disregard of the Constitution by simply conducting the Korean War without getting a congressional resolution at all. And ever since then, the executives have said, well, we don't really have to do that. Well, they need to take out a copy of the Constitution and open it and read it, and it says that Congress is supposed to have the power to declare war. Congress has also lost a significant amount of its budget power by the unitary executive budget. Now, I won't go into that too much, but of course the budget power is the remaining power that Congress really has to fund federal activities, and that keeps the executive in check, or is supposed to. Of course, that has also been eroded. An example of that is IranContra, where Reagan simply went around and he was forbidden by Congress to give aid to the Contras, and he simply did it anyway. IranContra was probably worse than Watergate in that respect because it really eviscerated the primary power of Congress in a secretive manner. So I think one of the big problems with this empire is not only is it costly, it's dangerous, and it also erodes the republic which we're supposed to be, which is supposed to be unique in the world, and which was unique in the world. And I think we still have the best form of government because we've slowed our checks and balances system has slowed the growth of government power, oppressive government power over time. Unfortunately, government power has increased, as Jefferson said it would, but it's probably increased slower than more slowly than other places. But I think that we've seen a dramatic expansion of government power during the War on Terror after 9/11, and also during this economic crisis. And I think conservatives also need to be careful when they preach small government, because warfare is the biggest cause of big government in human history. The nation state was created because warfare got too expensive for feudal kingdoms to do. And the conservatives created the welfare state. Otto von Bismarck in Germany was the first one to create the welfare state. And there are many conservatives over time, like Winston Churchill and others, who've contributed to the welfare state. And I would say that even Ronald Reagan, despite his image, contributed to the welfare state. And whenever you increase defense spending, there's always a log rolling that goes on, and people say, well, to support that, or to support your war, we're going to need this money over here, on this regulation over here. And that's exactly what happened during Ronald Reagan's presidency. Contrary to popular belief, Ronald Reagan increased spending as a percentage of GDP. And the reason that he did that is he wanted big defense spending, so he made an agreement, implicit agreement, or maybe even explicit behind the scenes, that he would exchange the defense spending for increased social spending by the Democrats. So this is the type of, I'm just using this as an example, this is why you get the warfare and the welfare state going together. And we saw this happen during the Bush administration. George Bush, despite supposedly being a conservative, spent more money than any president since Lyndon Johnson in domestic area. And then you add the tremendous defense spending. But of course the two went together, the defense spending. He added Medicare. He added the first entitlement since Lyndon Johnson. He put a Medicare drug benefit, piled that on a system that was in even worse shape than Social Security is. So these are the types of things, the warfare and the welfare state, do go together over history. And so I think we need to pay attention to that, that if you're going to have a big empire overseas, that's why original conservatives were against warfare and against empire. Now the neoconservatives, everything, which I say, and I have a broad definition of neoconservatism ever since William F. Buckley in the 50s, the neoconservatives have not been for small government. William F. Buckley said, well, you know, we got to fight the Soviets, and if we can get government smaller, fine. Well, of course, you can't do that when you're fighting the Soviets, because there's all sorts of trade-offs that you have to make domestically to get that money to counter the Soviets. So I think in the current, I'll finish up here, and we can go to questions. Our budget deficit, as I mentioned, is a whopping 10%. The national debt is 13 trillion, or 89% of GDP. That's 90% of our GDP is now the national debt. Now, we can no longer afford the empire, regardless of whether people want to do this or not. We really need to be more selective about our military interventions overseas. We need to use military only as a last resort. We certainly need to avoid fiascos like the Iraq fiasco. And I even question whether we really need to be. It's one thing to take out the Taliban after 9/11. It's another thing to run a nation-building quagmire, which has nothing to do with al-Qaeda at all. Now, Obama, in his recent national security document, sort of expanded and contracted Bush's war on terror. Now, he contracted it by saying, well, it's not really a war on terror. We can't fight all these groups, so we're just going to do al-Qaeda, which is a good thing. You got to focus on who your enemy is. We fought everybody else after 9/11 except al-Qaeda. And if we have fought al-Qaeda and gotten some of the leaders, but if we had concentrated on the enemy, I mean, it's sort of like fighting the Argentines after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, right? I mean, you got to fight the enemy that attacks you, right? That's the first principle of warfare, and it's not hard to figure out. But somehow these guys, the Washington mentality is use a crisis. And Obama's chief of staff actually said that, made the mistake of telling the truth, that they were using the economic crisis to pass the unrelated health care bill. So the Democrats do it too, but of course the Republicans did it with the Iraq War. Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, but they took advantage of the crisis to do this other thing. And then they forgot about what they were originally doing, and of course we're in the current situation. So we have to focus on the enemy, and Obama has done that, but he's expanded this fight on al-Qaeda to more countries using special forces and increasing these drone attacks. But the drone attacks are hitting not only al-Qaeda, suspected al-Qaeda people, but also the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistani Taliban, all of whom live in North Waziristan. Well, this guy who was in New York, he said he was doing this because the U.S. had been in Afghanistan and Iraq. He just said that yesterday. And he was helped by the Pakistani Taliban. Now, the Pakistani Taliban has never been out to get the U.S. They've been out after the Pakistani government. But now they're sending people to New York to put bombs in Times Square and maybe other places because we're bombing them. Why do we need to bomb the Pakistani Taliban targets? We don't need to do that. In fact, we should be trying to drive a wedge between the Taliban, negotiate with what elements of the Taliban that we can, drive a wedge between them and al-Qaeda, not push them together, which is, of course, what our policy is. We don't differentiate. This was just like in the Cold War where we thought that every communist was the same, right? But then we discovered, oh, the Chinese communists hate the Soviet communists. In fact, they hate them more than they hate us. So I think we need to differentiate some of these groups, which ones are attacking us and which ones are not. We need to focus on that. And we also many of these al-Qaeda groups locally, like Al-Qaeda of Arabian Peninsula, Al-Qaeda of the Maghreb, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, they're mainly concerned, despite their name, with local issues. So I would go after the main trunk of Al-Qaeda, and let's make sure these people are attacking the U.S. before we make more enemies. Most of the groups on the U.S. terrorism list don't attack the United States, so why don't we get them off the terrorism list? So I think Obama has narrowed the war a little bit, but then he's expanded the geographical scope in it, which is not good because I think anything with al-Qaeda stamped on it, he wants to go after. And I think we created this problem in Somalia. We've exacerbated the problem with Yemen, and of course the Yemenis sent the Nigerian underwear bomber over here, and we didn't have a problem with them before with the al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. So I think we need to be careful who we're attacking. And this is an imperial mentality. Hey, let's just get these people. You know, they're all the same, and you can't say they're all the same because they're not all the same. And we need to focus on who's attacking us and who's not. And I think we need to take a much more limited view of the military, of what we should do with the military. And I think we'll help the military do its job better, and we'll also be a more secure country. Thank you.